African Americans, certainly in Detroit, were able to be entrepreneurs and business owners. And in the very early days, it was to provide opportunities for people that look like them.
Hi there, my name is Taylor Claybrook. I'm an oral historian for the Detroit Historical Society. My job? I get to talk to people from across Metro Detroit to preserve their stories and experiences. Also, I can share that history with you. Our mission here at the Detroit Historical Society is to tell Detroit stories and why they matter. That is why over the past 2 years, we've been hard at work on The Hustle, Detroit's unsung entrepreneurs. The Hustle is a celebration of the rich tradition of Black entrepreneurship here in Detroit. In this episode, we're going to look at the history of Black entrepreneurship in Detroit and how the Great Migration changed everything.
African Americans lived in the city of Detroit and there have been African Americans living in the city of Detroit since the 1700s. However, they were always a small population until the Great Migration.
That's historian and educator Jamon Jordan. Jamon is the founder and owner of Black Scroll Network History and Tours and the official historian of the city of Detroit. For nearly 200 years, Detroit was home to few Black Detroiters. Enslaved Africans were first brought to Detroit as laborers by the French and then the British and lived and died in bondage in the city into the 1800s. By the 1830s, more and more free Blacks called Detroit their home, built businesses, and thrived. As the crisis over slavery worsened across the country, Detroit's Black community worked diligently and secretly to support runaways seeking freedom.
They're station masters, they're conductors, they're stockholders on the Underground Railroad. They're hiding people, they're bringing people to the city of Detroit, taking them from Detroit to Canada. All of that exists. Some of them are businessmen and women. Some of them are workers, so they are laborers for other businesses. Some of them are teachers. Some of them run churches, so they're ministers or on the staff of the church. And so but it's still a very small population.
Detroit's Black community remained small in the decades following the Civil War. Poor relations between whites and Blacks in the city and a resurgence of racial restrictions in the South kept the Black community relatively small. That would change as Black people across the American South began to flee north from racial terror and the state governments that supported it.
Jim Crow exists in various forms throughout the United States, but the form of Jim Crow in the South is highly violent. So the first thing is that between roughly 1870 and 1930, there's a lynching every day in a southern state. And so African Americans are fleeing the lynchings, which is really racial terrorism in the South. They're also fleeing the near slavery conditions of work, which is tenant farming.
Tenant farming, or sharecropping, is a system in which workers are allotted a small parcel of land by a landowner, and in return, the sharecropper must grow and sell cash crops like tobacco or cotton to survive. And after each harvest, the landowner is owed rent on the land, the tools, and even the seeds.
And by the time you're done paying this rent for all of these things that you're using that belongs to the landowner, many times you're in debt or very close to being in debt. And so now you have to work the next year to pay off the debt and for your own life, for your own livelihood. And you're probably going to be more in debt the next year. And so it's near slavery. And so people are escaping those conditions. They want to have a better way of life.
Many Southern Blacks sought out that better life in cities across the North. The mass exodus is known today as the Great Migration. Meatpacking plants in Chicago, steel mills in Pittsburgh, and automobile factories in Detroit attracted people from around the world, from the American South, from Europe, from Asia, and from South America. A steady supply of new laborers was essential as factories expanded across Detroit. To put the world on wheels, Detroit's auto leaders needed not only more horsepower, but manpower. Auto companies worked with Black churches and other Black institutions in the city to attract new workers to Detroit.
The auto industry doesn't have any ties to Black people working on plantations in Mississippi, but Black churches do. Black churches have family members, and they got relationships with people who live in Mississippi, in Alabama, in Georgia. And so Second Baptist Church and Bethel AME and St. Matthew's Episcopal Church and Ebenezer AME and Tabernacle Baptist Church, a number of these prominent African-American churches are helping to recruit African Americans to come to the city of Detroit. So otherwise, they would have probably still left the South, but they may have ended up in Chicago or Cleveland or Cincinnati or Boston. They were probably going to be leaving during the Great Migration. But the reason they're coming to Detroit is the auto industry and the institutions, the black institutions in the city of Detroit, who are helping to gear them or steer them to the city of Detroit.
The first wave arrived to a much smaller Detroit. The city was home to about 500,000 people, and its black community was just shy of 6,000. The neighborhoods west of Livernois are not yet part of the city. Neither is much of the east side. And the neighborhood north of New Center, that we know today as the North End, is literally the northern edge of the city. Detroit's black community was largely centered on the Lower East Side along Hastings Street, in a neighborhood called Black Bottom. Today, it's known as Eastern Downtown and Lafayette Park. The surge of new arrivals was far more than the neighborhood could handle. Established black Detroiters began moving to the North End, the Old West Side, and later Conan Gardens and 8 Mile, Wyoming.
Overwhelmingly, the business people here are people who are already here. Overwhelmingly African-American businessmen and white business owners who are willing to cater to African-Americans are going to profit the most from these newly arriving African-Americans coming from the South. So the stores that will sell to them, the shops that will give these African Americans things on credit because they're just getting here, and so they don't have income yet until they get established at the factory. Those will be the first group of businesses that will benefit and profit from these arriving African Americans, but it won't take long.
Detroit's population explosion dramatically changed the city. The constant need for more workers and the opportunity for high pay drew new arrivals to Detroit daily. Between 1910 and 1920, Detroit's population more than doubled to nearly 1 million. In Black Detroit, it grew from under 6,000 to more than 40,000.
By 1920, the black population has grown 611%. It has gone from a small, very small minority in the city of Detroit to a majority in certain neighborhoods. So there are neighborhoods now that almost everybody you see is African American, and almost everybody you see is not only African American, they came here from the South. So because of that, now you have people who are here who may work in the factory. So they may work in the factory, and now because they work in the factory, they get paid a living wage, and they can afford to patronize businesses that they would not have been able to patronize as a sharecropper in Mississippi. So that's going to help new businesses form or grow because now they have a income, they have a client base that they never would have had.
The dramatic expansion of Detroit's population and its territory created new space for Black Detroiters to create neighborhoods, businesses, and to cultivate community.
So while the man is working at the factory, his wife might be a tailor. She might know how to repair clothes, or she might run a cleaning business, or she might be a baker. And so now they have a couple of things going on. You might have a hairdresser in the family or a barber in the family. Sometimes the worker themselves who works at the factory has this other skill. And so when he's not at work, he's doing this other thing. He's doing carpentry work or he's doing something else. And so there's all these other businesses going on that are being financed by their employment at one of the auto factories. So now they're able to put the money to turn their skill into a real business. And in some cases, they're able to step away from the auto factory and just do the original, the business that they now have the financial wherewithal to continue. And so this becomes an explosion in African-American businesses in the 1920s and definitely by the 1930s. There's an explosion of African-American businesses.
A longtime landing pad for immigrants, Hastings Street swelled with Black businesses as new arrivals settled on the Lower East Side. The neighborhood of Black Bottom and the adjacent business district of Paradise Valley became the epicenter of Black business in Detroit, with Hastings Street at its beating heart.
So that's why Hastings Street is even bigger than all of the other business strips that are in the other African-American neighborhoods. There's business strips in the Old West Side. There's business strips in Conan Gardens. But the biggest business strip will be on and around Hastings Street because that is an area where immigrants were leaving from, particularly Jewish immigrants. Most of the businesses that African Americans had in the city of Detroit were in the neighborhoods that they lived in. But there's a plethora of them around Hastings Street. So Hastings Street is the biggest center of Black-owned businesses. Hastings Street itself and the streets surrounding Hastings Street.
As Detroit's Black community continued to grow, so too did the number of businesses that served it. From Joe Lewis's Brown Bomber Chicken Shack to William Johnson's Horseshoe Lounge to Helen and Lorenzo Malloy's shoe repair shop.
Probably the most successful and most dominant business that was legal was the funeral home business. So mortuary science becomes a major part, and some of those mortuary companies are still with us today. Some of the ones that we have today were the students of the ones that used to exist.
Charles Diggs, James Cole, O'Neill Swanson, and the McFall brothers all opened funeral homes in Detroit. Mortuary science was one of the few careers open to Blacks under Jim Crow segregation in the South.
There were many areas where African Americans were being blocked from participating in, but the ministry would be one thing that African Americans could do. Teaching is another thing that African Americans were less likely to be blocked from doing, and mortuary science, becoming a undertaker at that time is what they were calling it, but a mortician is what we call it today. Doing that kind of job was less restrictive because everything was segregated in the South. So who buried you, who took care of your body after you died, that was segregated in the South. So it had to be African Americans who could do these jobs because you could not be buried in a white cemetery, and you could not be taken care of in a white funeral home in the South. So it had to be Black people who had funeral homes. And so that becomes one of the major businesses. So these African Americans who are coming to the city of Detroit, many of them are already involved in mortuary science when they get here. And so they continue that business and expand it while they're here in the city of Detroit.
African Americans, certainly in Detroit, were able to be entrepreneurs and business owners. And in the very early days, it was to provide opportunities for people that look like them.
That's Detroit historian and journalist Ken Coleman. He is a senior reporter for Michigan Advance and the former senior editor at the Michigan Chronicle. African
Americans were very much able to create businesses on the Lower East Side and other sections of the city, and that ran the gamut. It was, in some cases, mom and pop grocery stores, in other cases, funeral homes, and certainly bars and clubs have always been a part of American culture, and that's no different in the Black community.
Detroit's seemingly constant expansion fueled the need for new businesses. The Black community tripled in population between 1920 and 1930 to 120,000.
But what a lot of people don't necessarily recognize is that African Americans, as early as the 1920s, moved in other neighborhoods of the city. That included what we call the Old West Side. Today, it's essentially the Northwestern High School neighborhood, Grand River, Tireman, West Grand Boulevard. Damon Keith comes to mind. The great federal judge, his family moved into that Old West Side in the late 1920s. But not only that section of the city, but also Conant Gardens on the city's northeast side. African Americans began to buy property and in some cases buy homes and in other cases build homes on the northeast side. And also there were families that moved into the section of the city that we know today as the North End, north of Grand Boulevard and for the most part east of Woodward.
Detroit's Black community was not welcome in large swaths of the city. White segregationists staunchly defended neighborhoods with fear and violence, virtually without consequence. Black Bottom, Paradise Valley, and the Hastings Street corridor continued to be vital to Detroit's Black economy, as smaller Black business districts in Detroit slowly grew.
The Black Bottom community was the sort of anchor of Black life in Detroit. And so whether you lived on the Lower East Side or lived in other sections of the city, chances are you certainly continue to or certainly did patronize business on the Lower East Side. A lot of Black expansion and movement within the city is church related, homes of worship. And so Second Baptist Church, located in downtown Detroit, of course, is the oldest African-American congregation in the city, founded in 1836. Second Baptist Church is the home of probably 20 or 30 Black churches throughout the city. It's sort of an anchor church. And so to the point, for example, Second Baptist Church is located in downtown Detroit. But one of the associate pastors in Second Baptist Church in the 1920s, a man by the name of Charles Hill, ventured out and helped to create an anchor for Hartford Avenue Baptist Church, located on the city's west side. And when I say that the church is an anchor, as churches opened and created opportunities for African Americans to worship, that also created an opportunity for African Americans to move into those neighborhoods, live in those neighborhoods, start families in those neighborhoods, work in those neighborhoods, and in a large way, create businesses in those neighborhoods.
And the advocacy worked. Thousands of new migrants arrived to work in Detroit's auto plants. But by the end of the decade, Detroit had more workers than work. The stock market crashed in 1929, and the decade-long Great Depression that followed ravaged the economy. Factories shuttered, workers joined bread lines, and migration to Detroit dwindled. That would change as Detroit transformed into the world's arsenal of democracy in the 1940s. Racial tensions in the city, however, ramped up as the city's population climbed, and the Black community increasingly had more access to jobs and positions traditionally reserved for white men. Crisis erupted with the Detroit race riot of 1943, which brought chaos and death to Detroit's streets.
That riot was a white backlash against a growing Black population in the city of Detroit. Some whites were concerned about their continued access to jobs. That was part of it. There was an anxiety around the Second World War that we were all in, but it just created that tension in the city of Detroit and in the nation. Detroit's African-American population doubles from about 140,000 people in 1940 to just over 300,000 people in 1950. And so the city is growing exponentially. As the African-American population increased significantly in the decade of the 40s going into 1952, African-American access to jobs and opportunities to move in different segments of the city increased as well.
The expansion of the Black community in Detroit was not welcomed by all. Mayor Albert Cobo in the 1950s actively discouraged the integration of neighborhoods, fought the construction of apartment buildings, and supported racist policies. The future of Black Bottom and Paradise Valley was brought into question as city leaders called for the area to be demolished and repurposed. By the end of the 1950s, most of Black Bottom, Paradise Valley, and the Hastings Street corridor would be gone.
And what happened to Black Bottom is that we don't necessarily conclusively know where a lot of the residents, African Americans, that lived in that community went after property was seized. Clearly, the city at that time doesn't do what communities do today, and that is to help families relocate. The city did a horrible job in transitioning those Black Bottom families, again, largely African American and largely poor, transitioning those families to housing in other spaces in the city, other places in the city.
The loss of Black Bottom and Paradise Valley destabilized and decentralized Detroit's Black community. Renters and homeowners were left homeless. Businesses were left without storefronts, and often not compensated properly for what was taken from them. In the aftermath, Black Detroit settled in new neighborhoods across the city and began to build anew.
In a lot of ways, thoroughfares like 12th Street became the new Hastings Street, if you will, a new location for African-American owned business. Certainly 12th Street was one of them, but when we look at other streets, other thoroughfares on the old west side, Tireman Road, Northwestern High School community becomes a popular commercial business strip for African Americans, and certainly large thoroughfares in the Conant Gardens area on the city's northeast side. They become sort of the new Hastings streets of African American life in Detroit.
The mass exodus of Detroit's white community began in 1952 and continued for the next 60 years. By 1980, over 1 million white people had left for somewhere else. The radical depopulation of Detroit reshaped life in the city for Black residents.
As the city's African American community grows through the 50s and 60s and 70s, and as white flight takes part and Detroit becomes a supermajority African American city, there's less of a premium or emphasis on streets that are largely African American commercial thoroughfares. Certainly by the 80s and 90s, when I become a teenager and an adult, Detroit is a super majority Black city, and so every community becomes a Black community. And so the Avenue of Fashion on Livernois continually becomes an African American center. You could certainly say continually in the Old West Side, the 12th Streets, the Grand Rivers, because the city becomes majority African American, a lot of the businesses there are owned by African Americans. And so there's the decentralization, if you will, of the city, means that it becomes one of America's chocolate cities, a supermajority that has an African American mayor and a majority African American city council and an African American school superintendent, African American judges. And there's less of sort of a sense that one section of town or one street or thoroughfare is an African American business hub. The whole city becomes a majority African American city.
Detroit's status as a supermajority Black city did not mean that Black merchants were free from competition, however. Non-Detroit, non-Black chains soon began taking over the space that locally owned mom-and-pop corner shops once held in the neighborhood.
As Detroit becomes a supermajority African-American city in the 1970s and 80s, what becomes striking is fewer and fewer of the neighborhood businesses are owned by African Americans. The Chaldean community becomes a larger business owning community in the city. And by the time you get to the 90s, there's no doubt about it. Many of the mom and pop businesses, if you will, in Detroit neighborhoods aren't really owned by the people that live in those neighborhoods, African Americans. They're owned by the Chaldean community or others. And so I remember being a teenager in the 80s and 90s and finding it striking that 8 or 9 of every 10 people that live on my block are Black, but only a handful of Black people own the businesses in my immediate neighborhood. Supermarkets, men and women who are franchisees for fast food establishments. Very few of those people look like me, but I live in a city that's a super majority Black city, and that was odd and striking to me.
My father was 16 when he came up by himself, and he came up by train. And at that time, again, due to the violence against African Americans in the South, a lot of those trains left very early in the morning, so it was almost surreptitiously that you could escape from the South.
That's Akosua Barthwell Evans, the CEO of the Barthwell Group, a Detroit-based strategic management consulting firm. She's also the daughter of Sidney Barthwell, founder and owner of legendary Barthwell Drugs. We sat down with Akosua to talk about her father's journey here during the Great Migration and how he built up Barthwell Drugs into a Detroit staple.
My father came up in the Great Migration. What was interesting was he came up by himself. His father, Jack Clinton Barthwell Sr., had come up earlier because my father was born in a small town in Georgia, Cordele, Georgia, which had, among other disparities, no public education for African Americans. My grandfather was an entrepreneur, which in that time meant with his horse and buggy, picking up people, doing odd jobs.
Jim Crow restricted what jobs Black people could have and dramatically limited what Black entrepreneurs were allowed to do. It was common practice for an individual family member to travel north first. Securing housing and employment before the whole family arrived was essential to ensuring families were not left outside when arriving to a new city. The Barthwell family's journey north, like many others, was born of necessity.
What happened was my father was very good in mathematics. So one of the Caucasian persons that my grandfather did errands for knew this and asked him if my father could please tutor his daughter in mathematics. It wasn't really a question in the South, it was a demand. And so my grandfather said, certainly. So my father went to the house to tutor the daughter in mathematics. But while he was there, the woman, the mistress of the home, asked my father to please come into the bathroom and wash her back. When my grandfather heard this, he knew that the next step might be a lynching of him or my father. So he decided to follow his relatives who had come to Detroit to work in the automobile plants, where Henry Ford was paying the miraculous sum of $5 a day, which was something my grandfather might not have made in a month. So my grandfather came first, and my father then, being the oldest child, since his brother, who was older, had died unnecessarily because there were no hospitals for blacks. And he had probably pneumonia, but he died unnecessarily. So my father, being the oldest child then, was the first to follow his father to Detroit.
The lack of strict segregation in public spaces across the North was a culture shock to many Black folks traveling during this era.
So my dad got on that train, and one thing he remembered the rest of his life, and he lived to be 99 years old, was that when he got to Ohio, for the first time, there was integration, and he could sit wherever he wanted to. He also remembered the sight of all of the trains coming in overhead, and he always remembered that.
The lack of Jim Crow segregation offered Black migrants new career opportunities and upward mobility, unheard of in the South. That is not to say that all careers were open to the Black community, however. Shaped by his upbringing in the South, Barthwell drew inspiration from the success of a man back in his hometown.
His goal was to be a business person because he, as I said, when he was in Cordele, he saw that the wealthiest Black person there was a pharmacist who had a big house.
Despite the lack of Southern-style Jim Crow segregation, racial barriers in housing, employment, banking, and medicine still existed in northern cities like Detroit. These barriers greatly limited the Black community's social mobility.
When he graduated, he had no job opportunity. His fellow classmates could all go and work in their dad's stores. So eventually he did find work in a store owned by a Black pharmacist, but he still wasn't really given the opportunity to, quote, be a pharmacist. He was more like a stock person. He would sweep a store, blah, blah, blah. And so what happened was the owners failed to pay their taxes. My dad had saved up his money, and so he was able to pay off the taxes and give them some small amount of money to buy out their interest, which I think was $500. And that's how he acquired his first store, which was on Russell and Alger.
Barthwell Drugs opened its doors in 1933 during the height of the Great Depression. Barthwell prospered despite the hardships, succeeding where many failed. Together with his wife Gladys, Barthwell developed Barthwell Drug Stores Incorporated into a Detroit powerhouse.
I think what was interesting about my dad's career, he had no MBA, but he was successful enough to build a chain of drugstores, 13, which included also some additional, two or three ice cream stores and a couple patent medicine stores. He had 21 flavors. So we always had ice cream at our house. And so some of my favorites were butter pecan, peach, strawberry, pistachio. He had a lot of orange sherbet. He had a lot of flavors, and it was really delicious.
The struggle to secure bank loans, to fund equipment, and purchase property for new locations repeatedly hindered Barthwell as he worked to expand the business.
There were challenges about getting loans for my dad throughout his business career. How did blacks deal with that? Well, first, he was a member and 2 times president of an organization called the Booker T. Washington Trade Association at the time, later Business Association. This was an organization of black businessmen and women who would meet, I think it was every Thursday, at the Lucy Thurman YWCA, or the St. Antoine YMCA. And they would discuss problems and talk about, well, how could they, support each other. And then the other thing he did was he and some of his peers started an organization called the Victory Loan and Savings Association. And this would give small loans to black business people. And then they would borrow from each other. He would borrow from relatives. And so it was kind of an informal way of getting capital. But it was never the amount of capital you might need to really compete.
The price of staying competitive is often high for small businesses. Competition is often a double-edged sword for businesses trying to stay above water. New businesses have a chance to start and thrive, but larger chains still hold significant sway over prices and locations.
The major chain when I was growing up was Cunningham's that had over 100 stores. And if I'm not mistaken, a family, the Shapiro family, they owned Cunningham's, they owned Shetler's, I think it was called, and then they had one other smaller chain of drugstores. And I think he knew the Shapiros. But capital was a major thing. And then, of course, the other challenge he faced was to make his prices competitive. He needed to have the ability to either get the credit from the wholesalers or to again have more capital so he could buy in the volume where he would qualify for lower prices.
From 1933 to 1987, Barthwell Drugstores Incorporated served Detroit. At its peak, it was the largest black-owned pharmacy chain in the nation. Barthwell's last pharmacy was in Southwest Detroit until it closed its doors in 1987. But for over 50 years, Barthwell Drugs brought medicine, ice cream, and neighborhood essentials to Detroiters while staying locally owned and operated. Barthwell's success in Detroit stands as a testament to what is possible for both native Detroiters and Detroiters by choice.
I think a lot of things my father did were more or less, if not spontaneous. There was not a clear-cut plan just because he had to always act on the moment. I think planning is important, and if you can, to have the capital to sustain yourself over the first couple of years. But I think the main lesson is don't be afraid to take a risk, and don't let anybody tell you that you can't accomplish something.
I'm Taylor Claybrook. Thank you so much for joining us. This podcast is produced by the Detroit Historical Society and Bank of America. It is executive produced by Billy Wall-Winkle. The Detroit Historical Society podcast team is Bill Pringle, Brendan Roney, Billy Wall-Winkle, and myself, Taylor Claybrook. Our editor is Christian Hanks. A special thanks to Jamon Jordan, Ken Coleman, and Akosua Barthwell Evans. A full bibliography will be available on our website for further reading. Now go and see what Detroit has to offer. Shop local, eat local. And now to play us out, Mr. E in the D.